I'm known as an atheist. And it's like, yeah, because I don't believe in God, but I'm not on the new atheist train of like,
It's definitely not.
yeah,
Definitely doesn't.
religion is ridiculous and God definitely doesn't exist and it's all evil and terrible and it's just been invented to console people. It's like, this is a serious phenomenon that needs to be properly tackled.
Welcome to Thinkers on Times Radio, you know, the show where we try and have a slightly longer conversation, a slightly more nuanced conversation, try and tackle some big ideas, wrestle them to the ground where we possibly can. Today we'll be talking about God, religion, the lack of religion. How does that all work in a world of morals or immorality? How secular are we as a people now? Are we heading increasingly more secular or actually increasingly less secular as we go along? And what is the purpose of all of these things? We might not quite get to what is the purpose of life, but it's really built into everything we're discussing today, I think. And exploring this with us, I'm delighted to say, is Alex O'Connor, better known as the Cosmic Skeptic. He's a writer, he's a speaker, he's a philosopher, he's a theologian, he's all sorts of things. He's a big old brain, and we're going to try and talk things over today. Alex, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's
quite a grand intro.
It's a grand intro. This is quite a grand subject.
Yeah.
You're known as an atheist, I suppose.
Yeah.
Is atheism an easy intellectual idea? I associate atheism with intellectuals. I would like to be considered an atheist, I suppose, myself. But so it's easy to doubt, it's easy to rail against institutions, it's easy to rail against thinking that's thousands of years old. Do you ever worry that it's almost the default position, atheism?
A lot of people frame it that way, that atheism is, as you say, the default position, the neutral stance, that is one of disbelief. Because, of course, the person who believes in God is the person who makes the proactive claim. You know, there is this thing which exists that I have some apprehension of, that if you're an atheist, you don't. And it kind of feels like the atheist is just neutrally saying, I'm unconvinced by that. But to me, there's actually a lot of debate, particularly in the online space, about the usage of the term atheist.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people say it just means a lack of belief in God. And a lot of people don't like that because that means this glass is an atheist because it lacks a belief in God, you know?
Yeah.
And so that's a little bit clunky. It's probably easier to think in terms of agnosticism being the best label for someone who sort of just doesn't believe.
Yeah.
And an atheist is somebody who thinks they have a reason to say there might be no God. You don't have to know that with certainty, but I think to be an atheist in the popular discussion just means you don't believe in God. But in the philosophical dialogue, if you're reading a paper or something and someone says atheism, they're talking about a positive position, which is that
A belief
God
system.
does not exist. Not a belief system, but a propositional belief
Yeah.
that there are no gods. You know, that's kind of the belief of atheism.
And an agnostic would say the case isn't proven.
They would either say, I mean, Gnosticism comes from gnosis, which just means knowledge,
know, yeah.
and without. So without knowledge, as opposed to theism, like theos, God, so without God. But without knowledge could mean one or two things. It might mean that you don't think it's possible to know. So some people think, you know, there's no way we could figure out if God exists or not. That's a kind of agnosticism. But others say, like, look, there are good arguments either side. Like, there's a really good argument from contingency for God's existence. But on the other side, you've got the problem of evil. And so they sort of sit in the middle because of a deliberative equilibrium, rather than a sort of, well, we can never approach an answer here, it's too beyond us.
And what do you think? Where are you on that spectrum?
I kind of think both are true at once, right? In that I think if God exists, he's likely to meet you where you're at. Like, the thing that I think a lot of people miss is that particularly with a personal God, like the Christian God, who's supposed to be someone, a person who wants to come to know you, it's very unlikely that he would place an intellectual barrier for entry to relationship with him. So if the only way you could properly come to know God was through some technical argument, some philosophical syllogism or something, that wouldn't be the kind of God that embodies something like the Christian faith, because that would mean that only smart people or people who have the brain for doing that philosophical argument and that understanding get to believe. That doesn't seem right. It has to be something much more personal. And so I would say that you don't need argumentation. And most people who I know who are religious don't say they believe in God or didn't come to believe in God because of some syllogism that they read.
Yeah.
As if after years and years of discussing this stuff, I'm finally going to come across like premise 94 of Ed Feser's massive argument and go, oh, there it is, there's God.
Cracked it.
It's unlikely. However, I do think if God exists, then he would also be discoverable through those philosophical methods. So there are things that can be known about him, but, God would also be something which ultimately transcends full apprehension, and that's not like a problem for me.
But that's almost an argument against the structure of religion as well, isn't it? Because for a God to require intercession by something, intercession by the church, intercession by holy books, intercession by the words, that's the heart of organised religion. It's the heart of Christianity. If you want to talk about Christianity, the word of God, logos and all of that, the idea is that God exists and then you need some sort of framework to enable you to have a relationship with God. And different Christians have different senses of that famously over the last 2,000 years. But the notion that something needs to intercede between you and God, does that make God less likely to exist in a way?
It points to the idea that to apprehend the divine requires some serious study. And throughout the history of religion, there's been this problem of authority, like who gets to interpret the scripture, who has the time to sit down and do the thinking so that they can tell other people what they should do and how they should practice. And I think that's what church authorities were sort of supposed to be, as you say, the interpreters. And in the case of, the bishops of the Catholic Church, in some sense, these are, there's this trust that these are the right person for the job because the Holy Spirit is guiding the selection process, particularly with the Bishop of Rome, right? I find that a little bit strange. I think that it's like what the Muslims say of God about how he's further away than the furthest star, but also closer to you than your jugular vein. Both are true at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think that...
And can you buy that?
Absolutely, yeah, because, God is quite clearly a more complicated entity to think about than the caricature that a lot of atheists, and particularly new atheists, provide. Like, when someone says they don't believe in God, I often like to just clarify, what is the referent of the word God there? Like, when you say that sentence, literally, what are you talking about? What is this God that you're imagining? Because for the classical theologians, God is the foundation of being. God is ultimately simple. God is the same thing as goodness and the same thing as beauty. So if you're imagining this entity with properties like goodness and power, and he sort of does stuff, you've sort of got the wrong image, right? And so, I understand, like Thomas Aquinas famously pointed out or argued that all religious language is analogical. None of it actually describes God.
It's all like a metaphor.
Exactly. God is so far beyond our comprehension that there's just no way we could even approximate understanding of him. But, so what that means is that God is not powerful. God is not loving. God is not knowledgeable, because these are all human concepts. But we use them in an analogous way to describe God, to give us a kind of idea of the stuff that we're talking about. But he's not knowledgeable in the way that a human is knowledgeable. He's not loving in the way that a human is loving. He sort of transcends all of that. And so Aquinas thinks that we're using, sort of approved metaphors to approximate an understanding of God. But of course, Aquinas himself, probably undisputedly the most important metaphysician in Christian history, writes the Summa Theologica, which is, to this day, a masterclass in theology. I mean, it's like, Catholics basically worship the man. They don't really, but you know what I mean. And near the end of his life, he's performing mass and he has a religious experience. And I think it kind of looks like he has a seizure or something. He's performing the Eucharist, and something happens to him, and he has some kind of religious experience, after which he stops writing the Summa Theologica. He leaves it unfinished when he died. And there are letters of people writing to him. It was either his friend or his patron, I can't remember, saying, Thomas, you've got to finish the book. You have to finish this. And he says, I can write no more. He says it's all straw compared to what I've seen. So even,
and what did he see?
Well, I don't know. I don't know to what extent he actually described what he saw, but the point is that it's ineffable. You can't describe it. But what we can take from it is the fact that even the person who is the most qualified to say that they understand the arguments for God's existence, the metaphysical necessity of God and all of this kind of stuff, the person who's probably best placed to have any kind of authority on that issue, himself said that all of that is straw compared to a single religious experience, because what really matters and what's really important is the experiential nature of God.
But it sounds almost to me that you're eloquently making the case for the existence of an ineffable God, a God that transcends everything, a God that's in the rocks and stones and the beginnings of the universe, and it could be an idea rather than an entity. So in that sense, you may be not a pure atheist. You're acknowledging something, and what you're saying is, when you start framing it as a man with a beard who strikes you down when you're bad, that is hard to believe. Mm-hmm. But we still don't know where life came from beyond a certain point. Yeah. So there's still questions that have to be asked, and God could just be a metaphor for the answer to those questions.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm doing my best to, I suppose, describe or define the God that I think we're talking about. Like, I'm describing God as ineffable and the foundation of being. I'm not on that boat, but what I'm trying to do is describe a position that some people hold to give people an idea that the kind of God that they're thinking about might not be the kind of God that the person they're talking to believes in, right? So like you say, if you believe in the man in the sky, broadly speaking, like, for example, the characterization of God in the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament as Christians call it, I think describes a kind of God who I think doesn't exist. No. I'm an atheist as regards to that God. Yeah. Because it is a much more... Firstly, the Old Testament seems to have some indications of of polytheism in the early Jewish belief. It's quite interesting. Or possibly a thing called henotheism, which is the belief that there are multiple gods, but only one of them is worthy of worship. Yeah. This is why God says to the Israelites, thou shalt have no other gods before me. It's sort of, instead of, I am the only God.
Yeah, before me.
It's like, I am the God. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, he says. Well, jealous of whom? There's this idea that there are these other gods that are being worshipped, but God is the main one. Also, some really interesting indications that early Jews believed that they had their God, Yahweh, of Israel, and other nations had their own gods as well. And it's only later, possibly in the Babylonian exile, that Yahweh, the localized Israelite God, becomes the monotheistic God of the universe, right? So the way that God is depicted in the Old Testament, I think, is much more of the sort of man in the sky image. Seems much more physical, much more human, much more angry, much more interactive in a literal sense with human beings, which
is like other gods of that period. A bit later on, Egyptian gods, Greek gods, that idea of their being effectively part of the world of jealousy and anger and wrath and physical intervention.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's unsurprising, to find those qualities associated with this ancient depiction of God. I mean, the history of Yahweh as a deity is absolutely fascinating. Like, it's a bit unclear where he comes from. We're not even sure if we're pronouncing it correctly because ancient Hebrew doesn't have vowels, and so we have YHWH. Yeah. And it could be like, Yiwa or Yeeha or whatever, or Yahoo. No one quite knows how it was actually pronounced. Yahweh is our best guess, but
and that becomes Jehovah, doesn't it? Somewhere along the line.
That's where you get the Jehovah's Witnesses from as well, like, who think that using the correct name for God is really important in worship, so that's why they insist on calling him Jehovah. There are all kinds of names for God. In fact, Jews typically don't say Yahweh. Like, no. it's a out of reverence for the name, they won't say it or write it down, which is why if you read the Old Testament in English, you'll sometimes read the words like the Lord. It'll be like, and then the Lord said this. If the Lord is in all capitals, it means that the Hebrew word there is Yahweh. Yeah. But they've translated it as the Lord because, Yahweh is a term that you're not really supposed to say. So if you see small caps, the Lord, then the Hebrew term is just the Lord. But if it's the Lord in all caps, it's Yahweh. So you get these interesting instances where it'll be like, the Lord, or the Lord, my Lord, or something, sort of saying Lord twice, but one's in caps and one's not. So the original said, Yahweh, the Lord, or something like that, It's really interesting.
Isn't it a sign, though, that this, and again, the danger with skepticism is it can seem snary and it can seem cynical. That being said, it's very hard not to see some of the build-up of religious thought from the Old Testament onwards as flummery, as artificial, arbitrary human beings trying to find a way of structure their society, human beings finding a way of settling scores, human beings finding a way of ordering their society, behind which there might be this ineffable essence. But the distinction between God and religion seems to be such an important one in this thinking, which is religion is human. It carries with it all sorts of prejudices and structures, and God might exist to the side of that, actually.
Oh, yeah, I think so. And I think that's a really important message of the New Testament as well. But if you read like the older books of the Old Testament, if you read Exodus and Deuteronomy, these are just legal texts.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, some of it's also narrative, of course, but yeah, it's just listing out laws, Leviticus, and this is where you get the famous prescriptions that are quite troublesome for Christianity, prohibitions against certain kinds of behaviors like witchcraft and homosexuality.
Yeah.
And so that's clearly supposed to be a legal foundation for a nation. It's unclear the extent to which a lot of these laws are actually implemented in practice, but this was clearly the injunction. Whereas if you move on to, say, the wisdom literature, if you move on to the Psalms, and you move on to the book of Job and Ecclesiastes, these are quite clearly like nothing to do with that. These are these ancient mythological tales that are supposed to function like any myth, which is to tell you like an interesting story and give you some moral message. And that is so clearly nothing to do with the structure of organized religion. There's got nothing to do with it at all. And so I think, and we are dealing with a separable book here. I mean, the Bible is a library, biblia. It should be in the plural because it's a bunch of books all put together, all of different genres.
Yeah.
And so the extent to which organized religion is separable from God is it's really important. And Jews with the Hebrew Bible in particular, the Tanakh, they separate out these elements. They separate out the law from the prophets, from the wisdom, because they're different genres and they do different things. For me, the most troublesome part of Christianity, for its truth, for me personally, is its clinging on to the Old Testament, is the fact that Jesus is portrayed as the fulfillment of the Jewish scripture. And so you cannot let go of this Yahweh figure in the Old Testament who's really troublesome.
And that's why they have to have him in Bethlehem to connect him to David and things like that. And so actually, because when you look at the historicity of Jesus, then it starts to I mean, there was clearly a guy called Jesus, but he wasn't born in Bethlehem. There wasn't a census. Herod was dead by this point. It seems to me that they wanted him in Bethlehem to connect him to the Old Testament. And does that matter? I mean, because there was a Jesus guy.
Yeah.
He said some stuff. Clearly, he said something so strong that people for the next 2,000 years have reacted, and indeed in the first 50 years they reacted very strongly to it. So there must be. That's one of the great interesting things about religion, isn't it? Why Jesus created a religion that lasted and spread around the world so quickly.
Yeah, Jesus did something extraordinary, and you're right to say that basically nobody doubts he existed. There are some Jesus mythicists who think that he didn't exist. But yeah, he existed. It's also quite well established that he was crucified, which is quite an extraordinary fact, because whatever he was saying annoyed people enough that they put him to death in the most sort of gory way a person can imagine. And it's unlikely to be the kind of thing that would have just been like made up out of the blue as well, because like God becoming a man is already troublesome enough for many people, but for him to be crucified, like now we see the cross as a really beautiful and important symbol. People wear it around their necks, but at the time, I mean, this is an instrument of torture. One of the
for slaves often as well.
Possibly the earliest depiction of Jesus that we have in art. I think it's tied for the so-called magical gemstone in the British Library, but tied for the earliest depiction of Jesus anywhere. Any image of Jesus is a bit of graffiti. It's a graffito which was etched into the wall of the Palatine Hill in Rome.
Yeah.
And I think it dates from I want to say the 2nd or 3rd century.
Okay.
Right. And it's a stick figure of a man with a donkey's head being crucified, and another man worshipping him. And it writes out in Greek, Alexamenos worships his god, or Alexamenos worships God. So somebody is making fun of this guy called Alexamenos for worshipping this donkey-headed god who gets crucified. Given that people used to mock Yahweh as a donkey-headed deity, that's a whole thing. And the fact that this man's on a cross, it's quite clearly Jesus being depicted. Somebody's worshipping a god who's crucified.
Yeah.
It's definitely a Christian image. But the very earliest depiction that we have is somebody making fun of Alexamenos because he's worshipping this crucified man.
Yeah.
So the story's quite extraordinary, right? The question is what actually happened. And an interesting thing about biographies, and the Gospels are biographies, basically, with, I think, some mythical elements as well. In particular, the birth narratives. Nobody really would have known who Jesus was. If we are to believe these stories, he's born of a virgin, it's all prophesied, and so of course people would know. But I think historically, nothing really happened with Jesus until he was in his 30s. So what is it that ancient biographers do with people like Alexander the Great? They construct these birth narratives, which are not historical, are not even really meant to be historical.
No, although they've been interpreted by people later on as historical.
Exactly. And so I think what's going on is, so Mark's gospel, our earliest gospel, has no birth narrative. And when Matthew and Luke come to write their Gospels, they think this is really important. We should have some kind of birth narrative. Luke's is the most elaborate. Begins with the pregnancy of Elizabeth with John the Baptist. But, you were right. There's this story in the birth narratives you'll have seen in the Nativity. It gets a bit confusing because, there's Bethlehem, but then Jesus is also from Nazareth and Galilee. And don't they go to Egypt at one point? And it's all a bit confusing. And it's because they're trying to fulfill these prophecies. So there's a prophecy in Hosea which says, out of Egypt I shall call my son, where God is clearly talking about Israel coming out of the land of Egypt. But this prophecy, out of Egypt I shall call my son, Matthew wanted to take this, or Luke wanted to take this and make it about Jesus. And so you get this story of the flight to Egypt, where Herod hears that the king of the Jews has been born, and he's like, we must kill all of the infants in the land. And so Joseph is warned in a dream, and they run away to Egypt, so that when they come back again, the Gospels can say, so fulfills the prophecy, out of Egypt I shall call my son. So maybe that did actually happen, but it's unlikely. Matthew at one point also quotes a prophecy that doesn't exist.
But does this matter? I mean, what this boils down to, that there was a historical Jesus, most likely. He wasn't necessarily the figure portrayed for the reasons you've just been describing, but he did go on to change the world fundamentally because people believed in whatever he was saying. Does the truth of what he was matter?
It does to Christians, because the big Christian claim is a physical one, which is that Jesus rose from the dead. And that's really important. Paul famously writes in 1 Corinthians, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, you're still in your sins, right? That is what allows for salvation.
And it's fundamentally, in a rational world, it's fundamentally implausible.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Resurrections seem pretty implausible, right? But with God, anything is possible, right? So it's not outside of the realm of possibility for me to imagine that if there is a God, he could do something like that. The issue is that for Christians, this is really important. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then it is all meaningless. Whereas if you're someone who just thinks Jesus had this really important message, even if you accept the mythicism around his birth and his death, you can still think that he was really important and that something really weird happened that made people found this religion around.
Which you would think. You would believe this.
I think so, yeah. I mean, to the extent that even in early Christianity, I'm a big fan of looking into the alternate, expanded edition, director's cut of the Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, or the apocryphal Gospels, I should say, because they're not all Gnostic, but these weird other Gospels that aren't part of the canon, mostly later. So the four Gospels in the Bible are probably our earliest, right? And we have these later texts, which people get confused when I discuss them because they think that they're true or trustworthy. They're not, but they do give us an insight into what people believed, because this was their text. This is what they thought. And a lot of these Gospels are either sort of unconcerned with the resurrection or think that it kind of doesn't matter. The Gospel of Thomas is a famous one. It's a list of sayings, doesn't mention the resurrection.
Does it mention the afterlife? Because that seems to be another critical part of this in religion. We had David Baddiel on this program talking about, he's an atheist, but he understands why people believe in God. And his argument is they believe in God because they need to believe there's something more after they die. And that's an argument for why Christianity is so successful, because it says to a bunch of downtrodden people, your life might be now, but it's going to be great thereafter.
I think that's a little bit unfair, because it's this sort of slave morality idea that you take, it's the Nietzschean view, that you take something which people can't help, which is their downtrodden status, they're poor, they don't have any power, they're essentially immiserated, and because they can't help being those things, they decide to invent like a system of virtue around them. So suddenly it's good to be, you know, the whole Sermon on the Mount, you know, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. It's very sort of, like it's designed to make you feel
it's
good.
Canny, it's mass media, it's approaching it's mass media.
But the thing is, this is clearly not just something which consoles people who are poor and humble. This is clearly something which people who are powerful and rich and well off discover when they have their come to Jesus moment and realize that it's all meaningless, right? And so it's not, I don't think it's as simple as like this was just invented to console people who are downtrodden, because then why would it also be so effective at transforming the lives of people whose lives are ostensibly going quite well? Powerful rulers convert to Christianity. You know, Constantine converting to Christianity set the Roman Empire.
Well, the genius that it does both is, I mean, that's the genius of Christianity. If you were to look at it from a PR campaign,
exactly,
it has a huge base.
But if it were true, that's what you'd expect. So the fact that you can describe it as, oh, you know, it brings comfort to people, and there's this implication that, well, that explains why it exists. You know, it's not true. It's just that it brings comfort to people. Well, if it were true, you would expect it to succeed basically any way you find it. And it does. Like anybody in any position in their life can find something in Christianity to like, right? And so I do think it's a little bit simplistic when people say, religion just gives you consolation, especially because so much of religion is not just about the afterlife. You know, the afterlife's a really important concept, but it's not like Christians are thinking about it day in and day out. They're thinking about the proper way to orient themselves.
And it's not there in Judaism either, is it?
That's true. Yeah, there's much less of a conception of the afterlife. And it's interesting how that evolves over time in the Bible as well, because the Bible is also this like written history. If you can work out roughly which texts are older and which ones are newer, you can track the way that beliefs shift. Like the existence of heaven and hell, the existence of Satan, for example, who begins as this character in the Old Testament, the Satan, the accuser, and he's part of God's divine council. Yeah. And he's like, you know, advising God and like bartering with God, to sort of later become this embodied being who tempts Jesus in the desert to, in Christian like history and mythology, to become like the ruler of hell. It's a trajectory that you can track. But I think what's really important is that most of the ideas that you associate with Christianity, like the afterlife and heaven and this kind of stuff, are essentially not biblical. Yeah. That is, at the very least, the way that they're characterized has much more to do with Dante than it has to do with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Yeah, so there's a great line in Hilary Mantel's one of her books about Thomas Cromwell, there's no popes in the Bible. Yeah. And that's the thing. Well, the Catholics will dispute that. But there's Peter, but there's no, there are no popes. I want to come back, if I can, to this notion then that we've talked about the religion, the structures of what follows religion, but I do want to try and get back to this, and maybe this is too simplistic. I'm just trying to understand where you end up with this, because there is an argument that this is the whole first cause argument. We don't know what started life. We don't know what started the universe. We can believe cosmologists who talk about the Big Bang, but we can't know what existed before that. How nothingness was created, how nothingness transferred into somethingness are impossible ideas. Now, that may be that's because we're thinking about them in the wrong way. And we think about things in a linear where maybe the world of quantum teaches we can't actually do that. But if we try and think of things in a linear way, there's still this first cause somewhere. And that first cause might be God. And if it's not God, we don't know what it is. That's right. And this is one of the things that Aquinas helpfully gave us. You know, we talked about Aquinas earlier, his famous 5 ways in the Summa Theologica, the 5 ways of sort of establishing or proving God's existence. And one of them is a causation argument. There are 3 which roughly follow the same kind of thinking, which is about causation. Like, we think that things happen with some kind of cause. There's some kind of reason why things occur. Some people want to say that causation just stretches back infinitely, or maybe it just ends in some brute fact. But it does seem a little bit strange, right? And interestingly, earlier you said, like, you referred to like ancient thinking. You said like, oh, you know, the way people thought thousands of years ago. On the like legalistic side, you know, how to organize society, you know, which taxes to pay, whether this person should be put to death. Yeah, sure, that's ancient thinking. But everything else, the existentialism of Ecclesiastes, the message of humility in the Gospels, this kind of stuff, but also the philosophical thinking, the first cause and where did it all come from, is not new. There's nothing like ancient and new about it. That is just the human condition. We've always wondered about these kinds of things. And so, there's a really strong argument that says stuff exists and stuff doesn't exist without some kind of cause. Or some kind of... And there's a period when stuff didn't exist, and how you go from that to that is a
there are scientific explanations for a certain part of that, but not necessarily the first part of that.
Yeah, but there aren't scientific explanations. I think is also a bit of a loose term, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of time, what science does is describes. It doesn't actually explain anything. When Isaac Newton discovers gravity, right? What does Isaac Newton do, right? We knew that things fall to the floor already. What he does is he looks at the planets, and he suddenly realizes maybe the same thing that causes this cup to fall to the ground is the same thing that keeps the moon in orbit around the Earth. That's a crazy thought. And what he realized is that, the moon is just constantly falling towards the Earth. It's just that it's also moving sideways, so it keeps missing the Earth, and that's why it's in orbit. And he mathematically describes the motion of the planets, and he famously discovers gravity, right?
But gravity existed before he discovered
But what did he say gravity actually was? He mathematically described it. But what did he say gravity was? He writes about this in the Scholium to the Principia Mathematica. He says, but as for what gravity actually is, the thing itself that I've been describing, hypothesis non fingo. I frame no hypothesis. I've got no clue. Right? He doesn't come close to explaining like why gravity does this and why it works in that way. He just describes how it does work.
Darwin does the same thing actually. With when you read the first text of Origin of Species, he said this is happening. But why it started and where it goes, he actually puts God. He could have taken God out of it completely, and he puts God back in because ultimately he doesn't want to go that further step because you can't really establish.
Do you know about the editorial decision he made in the second edition?
No,
this is fascinating. So at the end of the Origin of Species, this beautiful passage where he talks about, was where he says there is grandeur in this view of life, from ancient forms, whatever it's called, in few or many forms. Endless forms, most beautiful, are being and have been evolved, is like how it ends. It's this beautiful phrase, and it sums it all up. And it says like life having originally been breathed into a few forms or into one, from life having been breathed originally into few forms or into one, endless forms, most beautiful, have been and are being evolved. In the second edition, he adds in by the creator.
Yeah.
And it's unclear exactly why he did this. It seems like Darwin went back and forth on belief in God throughout his lifetime. His child died, and it had a profound effect on his belief in God. But also he recognized the beauty in the natural order. But it may also have been like a PR thing that he publishes The Origin of Species, and it's this huge problem for religion and becomes this incredible pariah. And so by the second edition, he decides to add it in. And by the third, he's taken it back out again.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting progression. Like we're not entirely sure like why he did that.
So I guess finally, I mean, we could talk about this for hours. It's so interesting, this stuff, because so much of it is there to be debated. It's an interesting point. So I'm just trying to understand where you've kind of finished.
Oh yeah, so that's really important, right? Is that why are we talking about science? Because the idea is, well, science explains so much, or science explains stuff that we used to not know about. Like to a degree, yeah, of course. I'm not going to say science isn't doing anything. Science does lots of really important stuff, and it's really important at describing and predicting. Yeah. And some people think it does explain other things to some degree. But to me, there is still the same, or maybe even more, like explanatory, agnosticism that we need to have. Because now all we've got is a scientific method which has shown us, how causation works at a molecular level, how chemistry works, how it functions, what quantum mechanics is doing, and obviously that's a great mystery, but we have some idea about various things and how they work. But why do things work in that way?
Yeah.
Any purely scientific explanation, I think, will never be able to get to the bottom of that question because of the fact, and that's the kind of thing a religious person says, right? They say, look, science can never answer all of your questions, that's why you need God. I'm saying science can never answer all of your questions. That's why this separate field of philosophy exists. Yeah, forget the God thing. Maybe that's something we'll establish later down the line. But at the least, what I'm trying to do is agree with the Christian apologists who say the whole science doesn't explain everything. I'm like, yeah, I agree with you. So let's put that on the shelf. Let's move to philosophy, and then we can debate God's existence in the philosophical realm. But the analogy I've always given, which may be accurate, maybe not, depending on the context, is like somebody discovering a book of Shakespeare's sonnets, like on the table here, and we were trying to explain where it came from. And I said, I don't know, but let's explore it, right? And so we started looking at it, and we discovered that it follows certain patterns. Like we realized that at the end of every passage, there's this little dot and we call it a full stop. And we've discovered this thing called the law of punctuation. And we realize the whole book follows it. And there's this, if we're really clever, we discover iambic pentameter. We realize that when you read it out, it does a particular rhythm.
The rhyme pattern.
Exactly. Dun, 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 dun. And we call that the law of iambic pentameter. And we start sort of describing all of these patterns that it's following. And I said to you, okay, that's great, but like, where do you think the book came from?
Yeah, why?
And you're like, well, we don't know yet, but look at all the progress we've made so far, like discovering all of these laws of literacy. Surely one day these laws of literacy will go on to explain the existence of the book. And you've just made a category error. You can't explain the existence of the book with the laws of literacy. And I think there might be something similar going on with trying to explain the beginning of the universe
with science,
with the laws of science. Especially because famously, with like the Big Bang at a singularity, the laws of physics just break down. The concepts that we use physically, like scientifically, no longer apply at a singularity. But philosophically, reason doesn't shift in that way.
So there is a potentially, and we have to leave it here, but there's a potentially a create, like Darwin, for your thinking.
Yeah.
You're not ruling out by the creator.
Yeah, of course. I think that's true. And that's why you said earlier that I'm known as an atheist. And it's like, yeah, because I don't believe in God, but I'm not on the new atheist train of like,
it's definitely not.
Yeah,
definitely
religion is ridiculous and God definitely doesn't exist and it's all evil and terrible and it's just been invented to console people. It's like, this is a serious phenomenon that needs to be properly tackled and dealt with. I treat it a bit more like if I were a physicist talking about string theory. There's a lot of debate about whether string theory is kind of clever and great or whether it's complete BS and completely unprovable. But the one thing that physicists won't do is treat it like it's just some stupid thing that scientists have only come up with to console themselves because they need some explanation as to what's at the foundation of reality. No, it's like an idea that people have that might be true, that deserves thorough investigation.
Well, listen, and I said at the start that it's easy to be sneery about religion, and I think not being sneery about religion is actually really important because it in many ways it still powers the world. It's still an important part of existence as we know it today. Alex, we carry on for this forever, but we better stop. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Of course. God bless.
God bless us all. That was Alex O'Connor there. I hope you enjoyed that. I think we tackled some fairly important subjects in a relatively brief amount of time. If you want to comment, you know what to do. Go behind the line, beneath the line. I know you'll be respectful and thoughtful. And do hit follow and subscribe, and we'll be back again. We try and do slightly long form, big ideas, clever people. I hope you enjoyed it today. We'll see you soon. Thank you.